the sons and daughters of today. Don't talk to me about yesterday, because yesterday is gone. And don't talk to me about tomorrow, because tomorrow didn't arrive yet. What I'm sure of that I'm here now. And I don't have much time to look back or to look forward. I'm here now. Let me enjoy the minute. Maybe some of you are this way, you know. But this is a very well rooted philosophy in this time and age. Actually, in every time and age, people absorb whatever we are doing now. Every age, look at children. Children also are absorbed, playing with whatever they are playing. Everybody is absorbed whatever they are doing now. This session will take us back over 200 years ago, when we didn't have cars or didn't have airplanes, and if you tell them anything like that, say, what are you doing? But we do ourselves a favor when we have it as a habit to look back. Never we regret looking back to see how people did things, as particularly the thinkers and the stars of their times, all times, who put lights for us, that we will discover that we benefit of their services. So Thomas Malthus is one of these stars, and this session is part of the first Eastern Illinois University Symposium on Science and Technology. And Dr. Stephen Daniel, Physics Department Chair, and myself wish that this would be the last, but the start of series. Maybe some of you would work on the 10th or 20th Symposium in times to come. The theme of the symposium is revolution in science and technology paradigm. And I'm sure we will be pleasantly surprised to see what Thomas Malthus has. I wouldn't find a better speaker to present this topic other than my friend and colleague, Dr. Mike Cornebise. So without much ado, please join me in welcoming him.
Okay, thank you all for coming out today. I did want to, actually I'd like to recognize Dr. Wabi and also Dr. Daniels. They put together an excellent symposium. I'd also highly encourage you to catch a few. We have some more presentations coming up. So there'll be some great speakers, great topics. So thank you, Wafiq. I appreciate that. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about Thomas Malthus. Those of you in my class, this will not be on the test. Okay, you don't have to take any notes on this, but this will build on things we have talked about with population. You may think back to our discussions in Chapter 2 on population. A few of these slides may seem and are quite familiar to you. So really what I want to do today, and my time is limited, so I can't really get into Malthus very deep. I mean, we're going to go over the basics of his ideas, but first I want to put this in the context of global population dynamics. In other words, we'll just show you what's been going on since Malthus's time up to the present. It may be surprising for some of you who haven't really seen or thought about it necessarily in that context. Also, we're going to take a look at who Malthus was and what is this idea of Malthusianism. From that point, we're going to talk about his legacies and talk about really two sides of a big debate. Okay, and people tend to fall on either side here, what we call neo-Malthusianists, those who believe that Malthus was largely correct. Okay, although we're going to kind of couch that. They thought he was correct in some areas maybe not. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then talk about a group on the complete other side of the spectrum, and we call them cornucopianists. In other words, they believe that, well, they think Malthus was dead wrong, and he went in the wrong direction. So we'll talk about that with the cornucopians. And then we'll do sort of a brief critique on Malthusianism and sum up with some conclusions. Okay, those of you from my class remember this slide, or at least I hope you remember this slide from Chapter 2. The thing I want to impress upon you, as Dr. Wabi mentioned, Malthus was active late 1700s, early 1800s. Okay? Now, at the time, of course, this was the advent of the Industrial Revolution. He was British, as we'll talk about, and so he was living through the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, that phase. But if we go back to about that time, this is about the time that the world hit about 1 billion people. For the first time in human history, it took until around, and I put 1800 to 1850 because it was somewhere in that time there that we hit 1 billion people. Now what I really want to impress on you is look at the shift from that time. It only took, once again, 80 to a little over 100 years to hit another billion, 30 years to add another billion, 15 years, we're at 4 billion, 12 years, we're at 5 billion, 12 more years, we're at 6, 12 more years. I'm sounding like a broken record, right? Seems like every 12 or so years we add another billion people. Now, that's hard to imagine. How do you conceptualize a billion people? As I tell my students, I don't want to tell you my age, but I can say in my lifetime the population has more than doubled. We are presently at 7.1 billion people, and projections show that by the year 2026 we'll be at about 8 billion people on the planet. Okay, so Malthus had some things to say about that. This is what we call, or the experience that we've seen since the 1800s is what we call exponential population growth. Population growing exponentially, meaning essentially like a rocket ship, just taking off. So when we talk about exponential population growth, this is what we're talking about. We had a little blip in the radar screen here with the Black Death, but since that time, population literally is almost like the trajectory of a airplane taking off, or a ship into outer space. So that's what we mean by exponential population growth. Thomas Malthus, born in 1766, died around 1834. Once again, this was at the advent of the Industrial Revolution, just to give you some context, at the time. Now, the other thing that's important about Malthus was he was an economist. He was a trained economist, but he was also a clergyman. Now, that's going to come into play, as we're going to find out. Some of his ideas really stem from that. The fact that he was in the clergy, that he had studied economics as well as history. So he had a good grounding in all of these things, in all of these areas. His most famous work is called An Essay on Principles of Population, published in 1798. Okay, now he first, it wasn't until later that we actually found out that Malthus was the one who published it. In other words, he published it anonymously or under a pseudonym, and to be honest, I can't remember what the name of the pseudonym was. But as it started to pick up speed, as people started to critique it and to talk about it, then he owned up and said, okay, I wrote this, and then became part of the debate. But before that time, he just wanted to put some ideas out there. That was really his whole purpose behind this. So, and we'll talk about his ideas, but as I said, originally, he didn't want to get involved in that conversation. Now, as I said, we don't have time to get into all the nitty-gritty, but just to give you a basic premise of what Malthus was all about, he thought that unchecked population, in other words, what we would call exponential population growth, what he would call exponential population growth, will outstrip subsistence. In other words, we won't be able to grow enough food to care for or to nourish those being born. Okay? So in other words, if we don't check population, it's going to take off like I showed you on the slide, and eventually food is going to run out. We won't be able to feed everybody. The planet cannot provide enough food. So in other words, population grows exponentially, while he said food grows arithmetically. Population grows this way, food grows in sort of a steady pattern. In other words, you can add acreage, but you can't exponentially grow more food. Well, as it turns out, that part was sort of incorrect, but we'll get to that here in just a minute. Okay, so as we talked about, exponential population growth is geometric growth that we discussed. Malthusian growth is what we call eruptive. And I'm going to show you a slide here in just a minute about eruptive growth, meaning that it follows Malthusian cycles. In other words, as population continues to grow, eventually food peters out. And then the result, unfortunately, is a die-off. Either die-off or, and this can happen at different levels, high infant mortality rates, people not living as long. With that die-off, then population goes down. Eventually, though, it recovers, and then, in other words, it's cyclical. And this is what we call eruptive or Malthusian growth. Okay? Growth follows cycles related to food ability. We also have, though, what's called logistic growth. And a lot of demographers, a demographer is someone who studies population patterns. So a lot of demographers today argue that this should be our goal, logistic population growth, because it levels off in relation to the carrying capacity Okay, students, you may remember we talked about carrying capacity. That's the ability of either a country, or in this case the planet, to support a given population. That's what the carrying capacity is. And the idea behind sustainable development is this very idea of logistic growth, that it follows food availability. Okay, now that's an important point to keep in mind, and we'll come back to that here in just a minute. So we were talking about eruptive growth. Excuse me, this is what it would look like. So in other words, the population would overshoot, outstripping the ability of the region or the planet, if you want to look at it as a total, to feed everybody. You'd have a dieback to this point. It would recover, and then eventually the idea is it would coalesce roughly with the carrying capacity of the environment. Okay, so that's a Malthusian or eruptive growth. Okay, so Malthus's basic premise is population grows exponentially. It will eventually outstrip the ability of a region or the planet to feed everybody. So what can we do about that? And so he came up with these, or described population checks. He proposed the following checks on population. First of these are what we call positive checks. These are essentially reactive. Now, positive, I don't mean that in the qualitative sense. He doesn't mean this is a good thing to happen. Rather, this is the bad thing that's going to happen. Positive meaning this is what Mother Nature is going to do to you, or do to us, if the food supply runs out. Okay? In other words, causes of mortality, and it's reactive. What I mean by reactive is it happens after the fact. After population grows to a certain extent, the earth kicks in, Mother Nature kicks in and reacts to that by causing mortality, or higher mortality rates. Malthus was correct in this, and most people who are hungry, they don't die of starvation. Matter of fact, relatively few people die of starvation. Rather, they die from the things that happen to you as a result of lack of food. That might be, disease. Disease is a big aspect of this. So in other words, your body is not well enough to fight off the disease, and the disease then can run rampant in an area where you have a weak population. Also, warfare. Okay, Malthus's idea, and others as well, say that, if there's not enough food, then people are going to start fighting over that food. So it's going to cause disease, it's going to cause warfare, and ultimately, this will feed a cycle of poverty. Okay, that was his end result. At the end of the day, this will feed a cycle of poverty. Okay, those were the positive checks. Once again, keeping in mind, he didn't mean that in a qualitative sense. Preventive checks are proactive. This is what humans can do to stave off the situation. In other words, limits to birth. Now, keep in mind that Malthus was a clergyman. He was a member of the church. He was a pastor and so forth. So he didn't agree, and even he didn't agree with birth control, in other words. A lot of his contemporaries even took him to task for that and said, hey, wait a minute. Birth control is a viable option. If we're really worried about these problems occurring, why not allow people to use birth control? Well, he said no. Essentially, up until his very end, he said no. Yes?
When you say birth control, do you mean preconceptive or after, not even that, or did they just abstain?
Well, no, abstention is something different. So birth control means some means to prevent births.
Well, wouldn't abstinence be a means to prevent births?
Yes, but he was, that's one of them. But he also said, obviously, no to abortion, no to infanticide, but also no to what we, in our day and age, condoms and things like that was no-go for him. Okay,
Did they
so
have abortion at the time?
they did, yes, but he disagreed with that. So
He was probably a little bit more brutal back then.
what's that?
The abortions.
Well, and this is his point, he preached what he called moral restraint. Okay, the only way to deal with this is abstinence coupled with later marriage and child rearing. His point was that, rather than going out procreating when you're young and you don't have any wealth established and things like that, that's just going to, continue the cycle of poverty. So he preached moral restraint, and really to the end of his days, he preached moral restraint. The other thing is he stressed the negative correlation between a person's station in life and the number of children. Essentially, that if you have too many kids, that's going to impact your ability to have a good life. Okay? But as we talked about in my class earlier, just to tie this back in, for a lot of people, particularly in poor societies, this is their strategy for escaping poverty, or certainly for alleviating poverty, because this was before the days of social welfare systems. This was before the day that you could count on a pension to retire on. So your pension, your welfare were your kids who were working, contributing to the family, and hopefully somebody to care for you when you get old. Okay? This went against Malthus's thinking. He said, no, family sizes need to be low. So that was part of the debate as well. Okay, now this slide's a little bit dated, but I do want to show you that, in fact, to kind of give you a little bit of perspective here, Malthus, whether you agree or disagree with Malthus, the experience has been, particularly since World War II, food production has actually outpaced population growth. Believe it or not. We have 7.1 billion people. On paper, their food production has actually stayed ahead of that. Now, does that mean everyone has plenty of food to eat around the world? No, it doesn't, because it's a distribution problem. It's an equality and a wealth issue more so than a production issue. But food has stayed ahead of production. So this is Malthus's theory. Food production would move in this way, population growth would move in this way. And this gap, then this is when we have the reactive things coming into play. Okay, the warfare, the disease, famine, things of that nature. In reality, and we can extend that out to the present, food production has stayed ahead of population growth. One of the reasons for that, and I don't have time to get into this, is really the advances of what we call the green revolution, not to be confused with green technologies, environmentally conscious technologies, things like that. Green revolution really means the advent of Western-style agricultural techniques to greatly increase production. And this just shows you what's been happening with wheat yields in the less developed countries, or the developing countries, from 1950 through 2004. They've taken off. Now, they have plateaued somewhat at the end, but that unfortunately is a topic for another discussion. But kind of getting back on task here, in other words, we have seen Western-style productive capacities being exported to less developed countries around the world. That has meant that food production has stayed ahead of population growth. So, my question to you is, does that mean Malthus was wrong? Well, we'll talk about that. Okay, first of all, in terms of his legacies, a group of people we call the Neo-Malthusianists. The Neo-Malthusianists declare that in many less developed countries, there are conditions that actually support what Malthus had to say. That carrying capacities have been overextended. That populations are in states of famine and disease, and all this warfare is kicking in. The Malthusian solution, so to speak. Okay? And they believe, of course, that his theory, even though it hasn't played out to the present, at least not globally speaking, will eventually be proven correct in the long term. Now, once again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into all of them. Two of the most famous they were both biologists, in fact. Garrett Hardin, who came up with the idea of the tragedy of the commons. Some of you may be familiar with that. And then the one I'm going to talk about today is Paul Ehrlich. And I'm focusing on Paul Ehrlich because he's the most famous of the Neo-Malthusianists. You may have even heard of some of his works before. And he is still very active. You'll hear he goes and speaks and publishes and so forth. Paul Ehrlich's a Neo-Malthusianist. He's a biologist at Stanford. He wrote two books, The Population Bomb and The Population Explosion. Now, I want you to think about the timing of these. Back in 1968, we were at about, 3+ billion people. And in the interim, between 1968 and 1990, the world witnessed the fastest growing year in history. 1989, we added 87 million people in the year, and it's the greatest amount ever in human history. Okay? 87 million people. That happened in 1989, right before his book, The Population Explosion, came out. Now, you can imagine with titles like Population Bomb and Population Explosion what the premise of this was. Essentially, and to take a quote from him, too many people, too little food, and then he added an extension to this, that Malthus got into a little bit, but not directly, and that's environmental degradation. He offered two solutions, and these are Malthusian solutions. Either you lower the birth rate, okay, getting back to preventive checks, or positive checks will kick in, a rise in the death rate will occur. Okay, so that's Paul Ehrlich. On the flip side of this is a guy named Julian Simon, who unfortunately he's passed on. He's no longer with us, but he was an economist at the University of Maryland. He wrote the book, The Ultimate Resource, in 1981. His basic premise was that he argued that population growth actually stimulates development. Okay? So he's saying rather than try to curb population, we need to not curb population, let it grow naturally, so to speak, or let it grow, because that's gonna help us grow economically speaking. Okay? And he, of course, was a free trade economist, saying that globalization is what's going to lift people out of poverty rather than trying to cut population growth. Now, the reason I bring up Simon and Ehrlich is because these are really the poster children, if you will, for on the one hand neo-Malthusianism, on the one hand the cornucopians, and a lot of their ideas, in fact, have been argued back and forth. There was a famous bet between Simon and Ehrlich. Anyone hear about this before, where Simon bet Ehrlich over a 10-year period, and this was back in the, what was it, 85 to 95, somewhere in there, that 5 metals would increase in price, or excuse me, would decrease in price, and Ehrlich said no, they will increase in price on the premise that they're going to become, as finite resources, more dear. They're going to become more expensive. Well, guess who won the bet? Yes. They did. All 5 of them decreased in price over that 10-year period. These were all, and I can't remember all of them. Tin was one of them. Aluminum was another one. There were several that he proposed, and all 5 of them decreased in price over that 10-year period. Now, Ehrlich cried foul and said, "Well, wait a minute now. You know, there's some things we got to take into account here. Energy costs at the time had declined, for one thing, or at least remained stable." Demand for some of these metals also was depressed, meaning that the price is not going to go up. So but at the same time, Simon said, "Look, the price went down for each of these," and he tied that, in fact, to greater technology. Guess what? Because of human ingenuity, and this is part of the cornucopian idea. Human ingenuity will allow us to increase our technological prowess and enable us to deal with the problems that the neo-Malthusianists point to population. Okay, we'll be able to provide because of human ingenuity, so to speak. Okay, there are some other critiques of Malthus and his theory. Now, first of all, why hasn't Malthus been proven correct in the year 2013 from a global standpoint? Well, I'm going to answer that question. That's rhetorical. But give me just a sec. I've only got a couple minutes here. First of all, he discounted the advances of the Industrial Revolution. Even though he was living in the advent of the Industrial Revolution, he didn't really give that much promise. He didn't think it would emerge the way it did. He also, and this isn't entirely his fault, because a lot of this didn't happen until after his death, but he did not foresee the great increases in food production that we've been able to harness. A lot of that has been since World War II, by the way. Okay, so obviously he couldn't look into the future and see that. But even in his day, he didn't envision that ever happening. Unfortunately, and this gets back to the question about birth control and abstinence, Malthus didn't have a very positive view of humankind. He thought that humans would just go out and procreate at will, you know, without caring for the future, and unless we gave them some incentive to do so, then we're doomed in a sense. Okay, so he had a rather low opinion of humankind. He was very much against welfare programs. He was very much against assisting the poor. Some of you may have heard of John Stuart Mill. He was an English economist and a philosopher. He weighed in this way. He said that economic comfort, so in other words, if you in a given society can establish a level of economic comfort so that people aren't out scrambling, trying to, you know, in a hard scrabble life, trying to put food on the table and provide for children and so forth, this is going to translate into stable populations. Okay, and that progress will be made culturally and socially. So John Stuart Mill said this will work itself out in a sense, that if people are provided for, well, then they'll have fewer kids, and they'll be more interested in cultural and social advancement. Arsène Dumont was a French demographer, and he kind of put a different spin on this. He said that people's desire to ascend the social hierarchy is going to serve to bring population growth down. If you give them the ability to improve themselves, they're going to have fewer children and invest more in their children so that they can climb socially. Okay, and this might sound like a contemporary idea, but Dumont mentioned this back in the 1800s, in fact. He talked about the fear of social slippage, that if people have too many kids, they fear that they will decline from a social standpoint. Some additional factors, of course, that Malthus really didn't dig into too much was he was envisioning the carrying capacity for an island, which is of course, the Great Britain, part of United Kingdom. He wasn't thinking beyond that. In other words, the ability to import food, the rise of colonialism, the rise of the Brits to be able to get sugar from the Caribbean and to get cotton from India and things of that nature. So this helps to alleviate overpopulation, help people redefine what we mean by carrying capacity. It's more of a global term rather than a country or regional focused term. Okay, so I'm almost out of time. Let me give you just a quick couple conclusions. Will Malthus ultimately be proven correct? The neo-Malthusians think that we have simply overextended our carrying capacity, and eventually we're going to come down the other side. Food production will level off or taper off, and eventually we will see we've simply just extended our time for human population growth the way it is. The other thing is, human population growth rates are actually in decline. Okay? The thing is that, and you guys remember this from class, we talked about the fact there's a lot of momentum built up in human population because most populations around the world are relatively young. They're getting ready to go through their reproductive years. So this is really sort of a telling time. How many kids they have can make a big difference. Okay? But rates of population have actually been in decline. We also have the unknown impact of global climate change, or the continued reliance on fossil fuels. So despite the bet between Simon and Ehrlich, we are talking about finite resources, fossil fuels in particular, and eventually they're going to run out. What impact will that have on the environment? And so I guess the ultimate question for me anyway, is the issue the lack of food or really the distribution of wealth? And since I am almost out of time, I'm going to leave it there. I think I have time maybe for one question or two.
Thank you very
Thank you. Yes.
How did the English Commonwealth play into all this?
Well, that's a good question, and a lot of the critics for Malthus said, "Hey, look, we need to think about this in a much broader perspective," because he really did think of. He spent almost. I don't think he traveled very much. Spent all his time in England. That was his focus, and so he didn't really have that broad scope of those who had been out in the Commonwealth and realized that, hey, the British Empire is expanding at that time.
Other questions? I have 10 questions.
Well, don't ask 10 questions, please.
Yes. Next.
Do you ever see things be proven correct with the fact that the less developed countries are trying to induce birth control and help control their population more?
I missed the first part of your question, Connor. What did you say?
Do you think he'll be proven correctly? Do you think we'll actually start downfalling? Or the fact that because we're actually trying to improve birth control and all that in most developed countries, that we won't be overpopulated and scrambling for.
It's an excellent question. He asked, do you think Malthus will ultimately be proven correct in light of the fact that a lot of countries now are actually actively engaging in what we call antinatalist strategies so that people don't have as many kids? And I think that hits the nail on the head, Connor, because for one reason, a lot of critics say Malthus may not ultimately be proven correct because we are taking proactive steps to reduce population. That will head off any doomsday Malthusian scenario from happening. So in fact, he may have been correct in theory, but in practice, we may be able to head that off because of, as you mentioned, societies are actively reducing population. Good point.
Other questions? Another chance for another. Let me ask a question about quantity and quality.
Yes.
We talk about, or when we deal with population, we tend to talk about it quantitatively, that we are increasing billions and billions and so forth.
That's right.
But I think we need to have more one dimension, which is the quality of the increase. Meaning, if you look into Europe now, you read that the birth control, birth rate is 1 point something, where any civilization to flourish or to continue and survive at least ethnically, you have to have at least 2, factor of 2. So, but if every family would get only 1, then the 2 parents and 4 grandparents produce only 1 in lifetime. So you can do the math, and people did the math because some in Europe and the Western countries in general would choose a certain type of style of lifestyle that let's enjoy our day today, not worry about children, because children are burden on us. And they now discovering that in 30 or 40 years, Germany will be gone, and France and Spain and Italy, if you look to the map. So in our lifetimes, in your lifetime, maybe it will be changed. And because they didn't find enough young people to support the pension system, they allow from third world people to come and work in any work, big taxes to cover them until they die. But guess what? In 50 years, you'll have Germany, not Beethoven's Germany or Mozart or whatever. It will be different ethnic group that didn't do good for the world. So this is another dimension maybe we need to look at. Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
But I mean, like, when you say Germany isn't going to be Germany in 50 years, like, there's no way to predict that.
I mean,
you can always guess and use mathematical equations for from what has already happened in the past. But like, there's no way for us to be like, this is what's going to happen. That's why there's still debate 200 years later.
I agree, and I'll leave the final word to our speaker. But there's something. This is not prediction, like saying in 50 years something will happen. That's not. But there's data today to see how many couples are getting married, how many children they have. So you see a trend going on. I mean, if you have a patient that his blood pressure is going and his kidney is failing, and it's not a prediction that he'll die.
Well, I might just add to that it is cyclical. I mean, a couple of years ago they were saying the same thing about Italy, but Italy now has actually been growing. Their population has turned around a little bit. So we have to be careful with the short term. But, and I'm sorry, I'm out of time. But go ahead. I don't, actually. I don't think we will. Part of it is, if you take a look at now, there's 2 factors in our population. One is immigration. We have to take into account immigration. The other is our rate of natural increase, which is actually fairly low. It's almost European standards. But what differentiates the United States from a country like Germany is we let in a lot of immigrants. And so that's the key. You know, getting back to policy, what is the policy going to be like 10, 20 years down the road? Will we continue to have a very liberal immigration policy? Or will we cut that down? If we do, we'll be similar to Europe. So I think it's sort of up. I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's.
No, please give
and I'm sorry, it's.
The final.
Okay, thank you all for coming out today. I did want to, actually I'd like to recognize Dr. Wabi and also Dr. Daniels. They put together an excellent symposium. I'd also highly encourage you to catch a few. We have some more presentations coming up. So there'll be some great speakers, great topics. So thank you, Wafiq. I appreciate that. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about Thomas Malthus. Those of you in my class, this will not be on the test. Okay, you don't have to take any notes on this, but this will build on things we have talked about. With population. You may think back to our discussions in Chapter 2 on population. A few of these slides may seem and are quite familiar to you. So really what I want to do today, and my time is limited, so I can't really get into Malthus very deep. I mean, we're going to go over the basics of his ideas. But first I want to put this in the context of global population dynamics. In other words, we'll just show you what's been going on since Malthus's time up to the present. It may be surprising for some of you who haven't really seen or thought about it necessarily in that context. Also, we're going to take a look at who Malthus was and what is this idea of Malthusianism. From that point, we're going to talk about his legacies and talk about really two sides of a big debate. Okay, and people tend to fall on either side here, what we call neo-Malthusianists, those who believe that Malthus was largely correct. Okay, although we're going to kind of couch that. They thought he was correct in some areas maybe not. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then talk about a group on the complete other side of the spectrum, and we call them cornucopianists. In other words, they believe that, well, they think Malthus was dead wrong, and he went in the wrong direction. So we'll talk about that with the cornucopians. And then we'll do sort of a brief critique on Malthusianism and sum up with some conclusions. Okay, those of you from my class remember this slide, or at least I hope you remember this slide from Chapter 2. The thing I want to impress upon you, as Dr. Wabi